Thank you for joining us for the Disinformation, Misinformation, and Fake News Teach Out. I'm Julia, one of your mentors. I'm a graduate fellow for Teach Outs at the Center for Academic Innovation here at the University of Michigan, and I'm a grad student that studies learning design and information science. I'm here with Sarah Brandt, James Park, and Paul Resnick, three of our Teach Out experts, and we're going to talk you through some of the connections that you learners have made between the two videos that James and Sarah created. Would the three of you mind reintroducing yourselves for our learners?
Sure thing, I'll start. Hi, my name is Sarah Brandt. I work at NewsGuard, where I head up our news literacy programs. And NewsGuard is a service run by journalists that rates the credibility of news websites.
Hi, I'm James Park. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Social Media Responsibility here at the University of Michigan. And I work really closely with Paul Resnick, who you're about to meet.
Hi, I'm Paul Resnick. I'm a professor at the School of Information and Associate Dean for Research, and I'm the Director of the Center for Social Media Responsibility.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for being here. So I'm going to go ahead and start with some questions that I've pulled together based on some of the connections that our learners made in the discussion forums. So our first question is that after watching the videos that James and Sarah contributed to the Teach Out, learners had a lot of different perspectives and questions surrounding the two purposes and goals of your sites. So what do you think the differences are between NewsGuard and IFI Quotient? And what are the overlaps? Sarah, let's start with you.
Sure, so I'll start with the overlaps. I think what NewsGuard and IFI Quotient are both designed to do is contribute to this large effort of addressing misinformation online, particularly on social media. And we go about that goal in different ways. So at NewsGuard, what we do is we rate the credibility of news sources, and we produce reviews of those news sources. And the idea is that we want to empower information consumers to learn more about the news articles and the sources they're seeing on social media and on Google, so that they can make better informed decisions and maybe not be duped by misinformation or share it with their friends.
Whereas the IFI Quotient is using as an input what Sarah's site is producing. So they're evaluating all of the sites, and their original intent was for end users, consumers, to use this to make better choices about what they're reading. We're using it to try to make an aggregate measure of how well the platforms are doing. So we take their ratings of the sites, we get all of the, which URLs are popular each day on Facebook and Twitter, and we say how many of them are NewsGuard red versus how many of them are NewsGuard green.
James, do you have anything to add?
I think both Sarah and Paul have really covered it really well. The only thing I would add, I think, is just to remind everyone that NewsGuard's methodology and our methodology are kind of put together in a pretty kind of clear and organized fashion so that it's applied kind of uniformly to everything. So it's a transparent set of criteria used, and we're not trying to kind of play favorites or anything. Everything gets treated the same way, and it's the same case with Facebook and Twitter are measured the same way. So we're trying to be kind of as uniform and as objective as possible.
Awesome. That's actually a really great segue to my next question. So one thing that's come up, not particularly in the connect and conversation space, but kind of throughout the Teach Out as a whole, is that learners are really curious about how experts in the field of mis or disinformation, such as yourselves, keep personal biases from trickling into your work. So James, you kind of alluded to that a minute ago, but I'd love to hear a little bit more in depth from the three of you. How do your experiences with creating and maintaining tools like IFI Quotient and NewsGuard, how do you keep your personal biases out of that process? Paul, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Okay. So I think James has really articulated the key is that we need to have uniform criteria that are spelled out, and we have transparency so that people can hold us accountable. We're sort of in the business of holding Twitter and Facebook accountable, but we need to be accountable as well. So we've you know, put out. You can click through to find all the details of what our methods are, and you know, NewsGuard is not the only place out there that is rating websites. We've chosen them as our primary source for the ratings, precisely because they are the most transparent about what their process is for rating the news sites. So I'd say transparency is our biggest way of holding ourselves and allowing the public to hold us accountable for those decisions that we're making where personal biases could come in.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that in the bios. You know, I was going through the, I'm part, you know, I just finished my School of Information degree, but I appreciated that, you know, when I went to look at the Center for Social Media Responsibility site for the first time, that you all have kind of your like professional affiliations and your interests and, you know, your funding sources kind of in your bios. So it's very clear, you know, on the site what exactly, you know, where exactly your perspectives are coming from, which I think learners really appreciate. Yeah. Sarah, what about you from the NewsGuard perspective?
Yeah, I think would love to echo a lot of what Paul had to say. I think transparency is paramount, and we've tried to build as much transparency into our process at NewsGuard as well. So likewise, we have all of the names and biographies and contact information for every single one of our journalists, analysts, or editors. You know, we name and identify all of our major funders, and we use a very transparent process. Basically, what we do is we rate every single website using the same 9 criteria that evaluate both their credibility and also the transparency of the website. So we're actually looking at how transparent our news websites as well. You know, we've tried to build in a few different safeguards against bias into our work as well. In addition to, you know, applying those 9 criteria consistently, we make sure that every single one of our reviews is seen and edited by multiple people on staff. And some of the reviews are actually discussed by our entire staff. And every single review we ever publish is edited and discussed and reviewed by our 2 co-founders, who serve as a kind of great balance at the top. And one thing I really appreciate about the 2 of them, Stephen Brill and Gordon Krovitz, is that they're actually kind of on opposite sides of the political spectrum personally. So Steve is traditionally a bit more left-leaning in his views, whereas Gordon is a bit more right-leaning in his views. So I think having those 2 review every single one of our reviews is really helpful to, you know, keep us honest and fair in our review process. And you know, one thing I do want to also acknowledge is the fact that, you know, ultimately we're humans producing these reviews, and you know, James and Paul and his team are humans designing the IFI quotient, and anything that's done by a human is inherently going to be influenced to some extent by bias. You know, what we can do is try to minimize the impact of that bias and just be aware of our own biases and acknowledge that they do exist and understand how they're influencing what we do and how we consume information.
Definitely. James, any thoughts?
Again, Paul and Sarah have hit a lot of the great points. The one thing I will add here, in addition to Sarah's final comment, is, yeah, we're all human and we're not perfect. But I think that on top of that, the great thing about humans over time is that we've also developed a lot of best practices, and we've developed methods that various fields as a whole have kind of settled on are good methods and best practices for that particular field. So in the case of NewsGuard, or in the case of us with IFI Quotient, we're adhering to a lot of the best professional practices of our fields, so as to kind of try to crowd out as much of the bias or human fallibility as we can. You know, we've developed these kinds of systems as large groups of people to try to, you know, maintain objectivity where we can, and to settle on what are the better things for us to do as a field. So I think that's what we try to lean on in all of our work.
And I'll just say that, you know, for the IFI quotient, there's a new number produced every day. What's the fraction of the popular articles on Facebook that were from IFI sites? What's the fraction from Twitter that were? So those numbers are produced every day. No human hands touch those numbers. That's all automated scripts that are running. And if we change something, we're not changing it for one day. We're changing a calculation, and we're changing the algorithm that will run every day for a long time. So it's not quite so easy to cook the books that way, because you can't go in and just manually adjust individual numbers.
So a lot of learners, this is kind of a segue, but a lot of learners said that they are being exposed to NewsGuard and IFI Quotient and other tools like this for the first time because of the Teach Out, which is really exciting. We have a lot of international learners from outside the United States, where U of M is, that are kind of discovering these tools for the first time. So I'm interested to hear about how or what advice you three would have for people that are starting to use these tools to become more news and media literate. What advice do you have? James, let's start with you this time.
Oh boy. I think I'll start by saying that I think a good practice in all of this is to use a healthy dose of common sense along with any tools that you have at your disposal. So in the realm of social media, we find that it's really easy to kind of have a knee-jerk reaction where you just click and share something because you read it and it immediately kind of sparked something in your brain. But I think that one of the things that I hope that someone could take away with IFI Quotient and related tools would be, if you see something that sounds too good to be true, or it's, if you happen to look at a details page on the IFI Quotient and you see a set of URLs that you've come across before, or a set of URLs from a site that you've seen before, or one you haven't, also think about what are the implications of sharing that information with other people if you don't have full confidence that it's being reported in a objective and fair way. I mean, it's kind of the same way when you tell someone just any old thing that you heard from the rumor mill. And if you did, then you kind of also should understand what the implications are. You know, if someone says something untrue or questionable about your brother and then just went ahead and said it to anyone they came across on the street, that has implications. And if there were an IFI Quotient for information about your brother, then you would hope that someone would use that tool before spreading rumors. So.
Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I guess I want to answer in two parts. So advice for using NewsGuard specifically, but also just advice for using any kind of tool that helps you avoid misinformation more generally. In terms of using NewsGuard for the first time, so the great thing about NewsGuard is it's really easy to, once you have it installed, see at a glance the red and green rating of a source and just get a really quick indication of the source's reliability. But what I would particularly recommend, especially for first-time users, is to go beyond the red and green rating and actually click and open it and read the full nutrition label review, because you'll get a much more nuanced understanding of the news sources that you're encountering that way. It's even a useful exercise for news sources that you've been consuming for years and you think you're familiar with. You know, you might still learn quite a bit from reading the label. But then in terms of just advice, more generally speaking, you know, I think what's really important is to acknowledge that a tool is just a tool. It serves a specific purpose, but it shouldn't be seen as like a panacea or used as a crutch. So it can be useful in certain circumstances, but it's only effective if you're also applying just critical thinking and as James said, common sense. And also try to think about ways that you can apply what you've learned from using that tool to other walks of life. So like with NewsGuard, for example, we rate news websites, but you could think about the way that we approach rating news websites to try to use those same criteria yourself when you're assessing things that maybe we wouldn't traditionally rate, like the credibility of a YouTube account or something like that.
And I think that's really helpful for a lot of people, kind of to expand the tool outside of, or expand the use of the tool, you know, the structure of the tool to contexts outside of like where the tool is used. I think that's like really helpful. So next question. This is specifically for James and Paul over some things that came up about IFI quotient. But Sarah, I'd also be interested, you know, because you work so closely with them, whether or not you have some thoughts as well. So learners were really interested in how something like IFI quotient, you know, which, you know, gives a rating to platforms like Facebook and Twitter, could be expanded to detail quotients beyond those social media sites. Say, for instance, tracking the iffiness, quote unquote, of a single news source article over time, or a single news source's articles over time, excuse me. Is this something that you've thought about for the tool, or is this something that you don't really see being within the tool's purview?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. We are, well, NewsGuard is rating sites, not articles.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And we are tracking articles that get popular on Facebook and Twitter, but we're not getting any information about those articles other than what site they came from. And we go and see what did NewsGuard say about the site. Even the iffiest site, the ones that get the worst ratings on NewsGuard, some of the things that they publish are true. And so we don't, you know, when we come out with something that says 11% of the most popular URLs on Facebook were iffy yesterday, that doesn't mean that 11% of the news that was shared on Facebook was wrong. There could be false information that came from good sites occasionally. They do make mistakes. And even the iffy sites, sometimes they put out things that are true. So we would love to have a better iffy quotient that actually measured what percentage of the news that was shared yesterday on Facebook was true. That's a lot harder, and we don't yet have the capability to do it. But we do have aspirations, and I'll share in a minute what that might look like. And if we did have some way to actually evaluate the articles, then we could do something like what people are asking for, instead of you know, just rating the sites by their journalistic practices. Maybe we could actually have something that says, well, this is a site that you know is 90% accurate, and this other site is only 70% accurate. So we don't have the capability to do that today because we don't have any way to, we're not even trying right now to evaluate individual articles. I would like to get to something that would evaluate individual articles through some kind of public jury system where we would ask people to rate individual articles, ask them to do some research, see if you can find other things. Of course, journalists are trained to do fact checking. The public is not. But we've been doing some tests, and it appears that several, if you sort of take the average of several opinions, they can do pretty well at assessing whether stories are true, false, misleading. And so we're thinking about maybe we could actually run some kind of volunteer jury service where people could rate things. And we're trying to think about how can you even maybe make it into a fun game to participate in, where see if you can guess what everybody else will say about this article. And we're hoping that by turning it into that kind of game, it'll make it fun, that people will want to participate in, and then we'll get their aggregated opinions and be able to use that. Maybe, you know, right now we're tracking the 5,000 most popular URLs every day on Facebook and Twitter. We probably can't get that big of a jury to participate, that we would get, you know, 10 people to rate each of 5,000 articles, but maybe we could get the most popular ones each day and actually get assessments of how good the individual articles were.
Sort of like a crowd-funded news assessment article assessment service, or like it's almost citizen science in a way, it sounds
Yeah,
like. It's
exactly.
really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, but
James?
not crowdfunded. You'd sort of be crowd labored.
Yeah. Crowdsourced maybe is the word I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah.
James, do you have any additional thoughts from the iffy quotient perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm going to say is probably going to tee Sarah up, but I think that one of the important things to keep in mind with IBI quotient is because of our partnership with NewsGuard, we're putting some of the trust and responsibility in NewsGuard's hands to continually check on the integrity of various news sources that are out there. And I think maybe this is the time to turn the stage over to Sarah, because then she'll talk a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we really wanted to make sure we did at NewsGuard was not just, one and done. We rate a website once and then it can never change. So we're constantly updating our reviews to reflect ways in which a site's content and its iffiness might change over time. And so we do see that happen. We do see news websites whose practices change over time, either for the better or for the worse, and that'll be reflected in the way that our review is updated. But of course, that process, isn't on the day-by-day, article-by-article level. It is still quite aggregated. The beauty of what we do by doing it in an entirely human-driven way is that it's very rigorous and transparent and detailed, but the downfall is that we can't get to the scale of rating hundreds of thousands of articles, and I don't think, without, I guess crowdsourcing is one way to get about that, to get towards that, but another way is if we feel like AI assessments can get to a point where they're accurate enough to serve as some sort of proxy for article reliability.
So one really prevalent theme in the discussion forums, again, this is something that kind of goes beyond the bounds of the connecting conversations, but I think it's going to be really important for learners to hear about, is that learners were really focused on finding the source, quote unquote, of a piece of information, a piece of disinformation. So, going back and trying to trace back to the source of a social media generated, piece of information that kind of has taken on a life of its own, as we see happen. So what level of importance would the three of you grant to trying to find that that source, or that kind of like, point where the disinformation sort of started? When you're on social media, do you think that that's necessarily important when you're trying to discern whether or not something is, a good piece of information to consider, or is it something that maybe is not quite as important? Paul, maybe let's start with you.
Well, there are multiple pieces of it. One is, if you're trying to assess, do you want to try to figure out where did it come from? Because that might make you more or less skeptical of it. But the other piece is, if there is misinformation or disinformation that's going around, can we figure out where did it originate? Is this Russian propaganda, or is it homegrown? Is it did this originate from the opposing political campaign, or did it originate from some independent actor? And I guess it makes sense that people are trying to do that as a form of accountability. It's not where we're focused. We're focused not on the source problem, but on the distribution problem. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to create accountability for the platforms, which are the source of, are the mechanism of widespread distribution. And we think they have certain responsibilities to, for some kinds of things, they should limit the reach that it has. And so that's just sort of a difference of focus, that we're focused on which things become popular and what are the mechanisms we can used to try to keep them from becoming too popular, as opposed to preventing anybody from ever saying anything that's false. I think it's just not that harmful if people are saying things that are false if they don't get very wide distribution. So we're focused on which things become very popular.
Good point. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so in terms of identifying the provenance of a piece of misinformation, so the very first point that it originated, that's something we've been trying to do a bit more of recently at NewsGuard. I think it's a really useful exercise for understanding the entire lifespan of misinformation, all the way from its very first point of origin to how it snowballs and spreads and then eventually goes viral. Understanding that ecosystem is really interesting, and I think it can be edifying for people who are trying to better understand and counter disinformation. In terms of, if you're just a general information consumer trying to understand whether something is true or false, it might not be necessary to go through that pretty intensive process of tracing a myth all the way back to its origin. In some cases, it requires a lot of research and reporting. Instead, what might be more useful is just, checking that claim with multiple different credible sources. And if you've found multiple credible sources that are relying on other, firsthand or other rigorous sourcing to make their claims, then you can feel, pretty confident that what you're reading is accurate or not.
James, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, Paul and Sarah have definitely covered a lot of good ground. I don't know that I have anything kind of major to add. I think maybe one of the questions when we say source, it really can come down to the fact that, as both Paul and Sarah have alluded to, there is a point of origin for a claim or an argument or a story. And that could be like just a single person saying it, or of course it could be like an event that was witnessed, and so then you have a lot of accounts. So that could be like the source. But of course then you also have a particular story may break thanks to like one publication being the first to talk about it. And in that case, then it also becomes a question of the trustworthiness of that reporting source, right? And of course, for us involved with the quotient and for NewsGuard, what we deal with most often are those reporting sources, and of course, those reporting sources often have to work with investigative methods and whatnot to identify or even be in touch with the kind of actual point of origin. So it's complicated. I would say that, again, it's about trying to develop a framework of understanding and trusting reporting sources that tend to have kind of more high integrity methods. And again, they adhere to the best practices of the profession. And I think when you can feel good about that, you can generally feel better about what you're hearing from those reporting sources. Because I think it's pretty difficult or impossible for us as individual humans to always kind of track down the actual like earthly point of origin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think that's really important and gives some perspective to folks who are, maybe sorting through their media literacy skills for the first time. Wonderful. We've reached the end of our time here together with Paul, Sarah, and James. Thank you all so much for giving your time to address some of these connections that learners made and the questions that they had. Learners, thank you so much for tuning into this Connecting Conversations chat as part of the Disinformation, Misinformation, and Fake News Teach Out at the University of Michigan.